Welcome back. Today I'm going to take you through a game that I played not too long ago. By the way, one of the ways that I come up with content for this channel, besides just playing live games on camera or solving puzzles, is when I do play a game or see a game that's interesting to me, I'll make a note of it in a text file. I'll put the link to the game there and put a little note. The note on this one said 17 checks. And I do remember just checking a lot, but I don't know, because I didn't run the analysis yet, whether all of those checks were the best moves. There were places where I had multiple choices to check. And it's possible I could have ended this game sooner. It's possible that I could have ended it very quickly, and it's possible that my opponent had chances there, but then gave them away and allowed even more checks. So I'm going to look at the analysis here on chess.com. I did notice that the game review said that I had 3 misses and 1 mistake. I don't know if that was during the checking sequences where I had something like 17 checks in a row, or if that was before that. We're about to find out. Let's switch over to the analysis tab. This is just before I switched to e4. I told you this game was from a little while back, several weeks ago, I think. So I did open with d4, and we ended up getting the Queen's Gambit and then the Slav defense. Now, I know from experience that these positions are pretty close to even until one of the players makes a mistake. So I'm just going to take it out until one of us makes a mistake until we see the eval bar jump. Looks like all of those were fairly regular, normal opening moves for the semi-Slav, which is what this transposed into. And we're at dead even according to the evaluation bar. My opponent should play e5 here. Now that we're both castled, Stockfish wants the center to start breaking open. It says once they did that, I would take back here. But what my opponent played was b6. I think they were concerned about this bishop being stuck back here. In the semi-Slav, just as with the French defense, the light squared bishop sometimes gets trapped, and I think that's one downside with lower rated players, including myself, who have played the semi-Slav. We start to worry about that dark squared bishop not being developed, and we start looking for ways to get it out. That didn't turn out to be a huge mistake for my opponent. It just wasn't one of their very best moves. They're looking to get this dark squared bishop, light squared bishop out over here on this very short diagonal, but then it would be, they hope, in a much more powerful place. I did play one of my best moves here according to the engine, as did my opponent. Nobody's even made an inaccuracy yet, and we're very close to even. And here again, my opponent was supposed to play e5, was their best move, and it says I wouldn't have taken or pushed past. It says I would have played h3 at that point. But they played their second best move, which was counted as the first inaccuracy of the game. And now Stockfish is suggesting I should take here on e6 with my bishop. I don't think I would play that. I would lose a bishop for a pawn. But it says after that, then I could play e5, and I would be doing well. I've learned to trust Stockfish, especially running at a slightly deeper depth like this, but I don't understand how that would put me ahead. And that might be a line that only a computer could do something with later down the road, giving up a bishop for a pawn. My second best move would be to bring the light squared bishop back here, but that's what I played, and it was counted as inaccurate by the game review, but it's not that bad. I still have a very slight advantage. Well, now my opponent did what they'd been planning to do the whole time. The whole reason that they moved these pawns was to put this bishop here. Now, I'm not sure why they did b6 and then b5. Maybe they had a reason. But now they put their bishop out here, which was counted as a blunder. I'm trying to figure out why it was counted as a blunder. It looks like possibly their intention was to play here and they wanted to be defending this pawn, but surely they could have done that by playing the a pawn first, because they can't move this now because they'll just lose their bishop. So that pawn is effectively pinned. And if they wanted to play this, they could have played it before because they already had 2 pieces guarding c5. So I'm not sure what that was for, but I'm also not sure why it's a blunder. Stockfish says it's only a blunder if I take advantage of it, which is usually the case. And the only way I can take advantage of it is here. I see that now. I didn't play this. Part of the move list is blocked by my camera view, but this would be a pawn fork. According to my insights page on chess.com, which I still have access to, because my diamond membership hasn't run out yet. It's going to in a month or so, and I'm going to revert back to gold, or whatever the lowest one is called. But in those insights, it said I miss pawn forks a lot, and I missed this one. I could have forked those 2 pieces with my pawn. It's as if I had played that, they just would have dropped this back, and I would have got the knight for a pawn, because they would have, I assume, taken back with the bishop, or the knight. It says they would have taken back with the knight, but it doesn't matter. I would have got the knight for a pawn. Okay, but I didn't see that just yet. The move I played is not listed among my top 3, and that was pinning this knight here. I think maybe I was having the same problem as my opponent with, in my case, the dark squared bishop. In many d-pawn openings that aren't the London, the dark squared bishop has trouble getting out. But in this case, because I had already had 2 pawns in the center, I could get my dark squared bishop out, and I was still trying, just as I am today, still trying to practice opening principles. take control of the center, or at least occupy and contest the center squares, develop your pieces to strong squares, get your king to safety, connect your rooks. Well, this developed my last piece and connected the rooks, but it was counted as a miss, and it's a miss because I didn't see e5. Now my opponent needs to play e5, but they didn't. Their next move was also a blunder, but I see what that was doing. It was getting out of this pin. They wanted to move this knight, apparently, and they didn't want their queen to be in that line. But that was a blunder because it allows e5 again, and this time I found it. Interestingly enough, before, when it said I should play e5 on the previous turn, it said they would put this bishop back here to add a measure of protection to that knight. But now the computer says b4 is their best move. Okay, now maybe my opponent was planning on playing b4, because they did move their queen over here, which protects this bishop, so it's not hanging anymore once the b-pawn moves. The b-pawn threatens this knight, which doesn't have a lot of good places to go. I guess it could go to the a-file, but yeah, Stockfish is suggesting b4. And it says when they did, I would play knight to a4, and then those two pieces would still be hanging. One of them, whichever one I choose to take, or whichever one the opponent doesn't choose to save. And it says when I did that, when I moved the knight over, they would take this bishop, where I would take, and then those two pieces would still be hanging. Now, amazingly, considering my opponent's last two moves were blunders, they played b4. But that still leaves me at +2 because I still have these two pieces hanging, and I can save this one. Did I save that one? I didn't. I have to either take this bishop now, which leaves me at +2, move the knight back, which leaves me at +2, or move the knight over there, which is +2.2. I saved the knight by going this way, which takes us back to under +1. And that's because this knight can get out of the pin this way. Of course it is. Okay, well they did that. I can still take this bishop with my pawn, but this bishop's hanging. Okay, well here I figured the only way to save this bishop, at least temporarily, was to take that one first, because that one threatens their queen. So they're not gonna take this bishop over here on the g-file just yet, because my bishop will be here. So they would take back. And then I figured once they took back, then I could take the knight here, but that leaves us about even, doesn't it? Stockfish says I should take the knight first, but this is about the same. So I took that, and they took back, and then I took the knight, and I'm still up just a little bit. But now they can save this bishop, so I messed up on the whole pawn fork idea. And I see that now, and I think I understand it. So I'm trying to figure out, if we came out even on material, why do I have a +0.9? Because I'm not up a pawn. But it must be because I have a strong center here, where this front pawn is basically unassailable, and it's controlling squares across the edge of the board. This pawn is controlling squares. This back pawn is defended twice. The bishop can retract if it needs to. It's not trapped out there. Plus, I have open files I can put my rooks on. It actually says here my best move is to bring this bishop back. Oh no, it says my best move is to go up here. Oh, nice. Because it threatens the rook and the pawn at the same time. And so they would, I assume, save the rook by moving it, and then I would pick up that pawn? I found it. Pretty proud of that. Well, they did move the rook, but they didn't move it to the right place. They moved it over here to try to protect this pawn. I'm not sure exactly what the problem with that is, but I know now that I have my knight and my queen over here, and nothing's left protecting this king, and the king can't run because my bishop's there. Why not put a knight here on g5 and threaten mate immediately and see what they do about it? So I did that. Oh, and they counted that as a great move. Okay, well, g6 is the best response, and that is what my opponent played. And Stockfish wants me to play queen to f3 here. That would be threatening mate again. And then they would have to bring this rook back. And I would take it with my bishop, I assume. And then their other rook would take. And then they wouldn't be under a mate threat anymore, but I would have gone up in exchange. Okay, well, I see that now. Second best move is queen to h4, which threatens mate over here. But in that case, they could just play h5. And my queen would be sitting here not doing a whole lot. Then it says I would come back over here, threatening this. And then they would do the rook to f8 thing again. Okay, well, I didn't see any of that. Instead, I thought, what about playing h4? Well, that turns out to be a mistake. Obviously in the game, you can't see what the engine is suggesting, and I know that in a lot of evaluations, even after I've castled, Stockfish says to play h4. Now, my idea here was to just keep going, because they don't have any rooks or queens over here on anywhere near the h-file, or anywhere that can get to the h-file quickly. So my idea was to try to break open the h-file, because I don't have to worry about them coming down through here. Now, I figured they could stop it by playing h5. Stockfish says their actual best move is to come back over here and threaten this bishop, and I think if they did, then I would take this pawn. Okay, well, what my opponent played was that. I think their idea was to help get rid of this bishop. to either force a trade or force me to go someplace else. I don't know what their idea was, and the engine still says that my best move is queen to f3 or queen to f4, and I'm up +6 now. Wait, so that wasn't a mistake. We're at +1. Now we're at +6, almost +7. That's a blunder. The game review is way off here. Going from near even to completely won for your opponent, that's a blunder. But yeah, Stockfish says I should play queen to f4 or queen to f3 or just take it. Even if I just take it, I'm still up a few more percentage points than I was before. Well, what I saw was I have a nice outpost for my bishop here that would be threatening that rook again. And so that's what I played, and it's kind of that as a miss because I didn't see one of those two moves. But I still have a slight advantage, and I've learned around my level a lot of times one way to win is to keep threatening your opponent's pieces because then they have to move them, and they don't always move them to the best squares. In this case, Stockfish says to move it to b5, and that's what my opponent did. So that was their best move. And I'm supposed to threaten it immediately with a4. Couldn't they? And I guess if they en passanted it, then I would just go back? I'm not sure. Stockfish has changed its mind. It says I should put a rook on the open c file here. I guess aiming at that pawn, which I have a queen pointed at as well. But a4 or rook f to c1 or knight to f3. It says, why don't you get your knight out of there? Well, I had already started this pawn assault over here, and so I thought, why not keep it going? But my knight's in the way of my g-pawn. So I got the knight out of the way of the g-pawn, and now it can protect these two squares here. That turned out to be inaccurate. If my opponent will play rook to c8, or queen to b7, or b3, I'm not sure what b3 would do. I would just push my a pawn up one. And I guess rook to c8 is aiming to get behind this pawn, and of course, queen to b7 would be lining up with my queen, perhaps thinking about pushing that pawn with a discovered attack on my undefended queen. I'm not sure. And they did play one of those. They played rook to c8. I know there haven't been any checks yet, but we're getting there. We're almost halfway through the game, and here in just a little bit, it switches over to all checks all the time. I promise. Unless I pulled up the wrong game. That was a bad joke. Sorry, I didn't pull up the wrong game. Okay, I will go faster now. Now it says my best move is knight to f4. I'm not sure why, because I can't attack any of those pawns. Maybe I'm supposed to swing around this way? Oh, knight to f4 would protect the h-pawn push. I finally played queen to f4, which the computer had been suggesting all along, but that was counted as inaccurate, and now we're down to 0.3. Almost even. My opponent needs to play rook to a5, and they did. They now have lots of pieces lining up down here. Looks like they're going to win my a-pawn, and I'm supposed to slide my queen in there to h6. Not sure why, because it can't do anything from h6, at least not yet. And my bishop, well, I guess I could, no, I can't put my bishop there because their knight's guarding that square. So I probably wouldn't have spotted that. I don't know what it would do. I guess it would keep their h-pawn from pushing forward, so when I pushed my h-pawn, their g-pawn would either have to take or get taken or move past where it would get taken with check. No, it wouldn't because their bishop's there. Guess I would have to take that with my knight. Yeah, queen to h6 is a little bit higher level than I'm used to seeing. Second best move is a3. Well, that's what I played, but it was counted as inaccurate, yet the evaluation remains about the same. My opponent is supposed to take now. I assume they didn't because that square's guarded 3 times. By the pawn, by the bishop, by the rook. Well, they pushed forward. The problem with that, obviously, is now they don't have any other way to attack this, and that a-pawn is stuck. And they're not going to waste either one of these 2 heavy pieces to a pawn or a bishop breaking through there. I do understand why b3 was a mistake. I had assumed they were going to take, and I wasn't yet sure whether I was going to take back with my bishop or my pawn. Probably the pawn, and then I could put the bishop here on b3 or b4 and locking it in place with the pawn. They would be protecting each other. But they pushed forward, so I was able to relax just a little bit over there. Well, I told you about my plan over here with the h-pawn. Stockfish doesn't like it at all, but I pushed that h-pawn forward because they can't bypass the h-pawn, right? If they do, again, I could take with my knight. If they took back with my bishop, I would take there with my queen, and that would be check. And I would have this pawn getting really close to being able to protect me down there, and their king can't escape that way. So I thought this was a brilliant move, but Stockfish didn't agree. Stockfish says they need to start bringing their queen back around this way to help guard the king side. Either queen to d3 or even e2. I'm not sure exactly what e2 does. I mean, e2 points at this pawn, but I'm planning on taking that pawn with my pawn if they don't do something quick. But what my opponent saw was that my d-pawn is kind of backward, I guess, and they decided to attack it here with their rook. I assumed that they weren't about to take it with their rook because it is protected, but perhaps they were about to push this c-pawn. They've got a rook behind this c-pawn. They've got a rook right here. they know I won't take with this pawn because my queen's back there. So that's the only thing I can think of, is that they were planning on counterplay on this side, hoping perhaps that I would take and not realize that my queen would be hanging then. But that was an inaccuracy on their part. We're still under +1 though. Now, it's not my best move, but it is the move that I had been planning on making for some time. I took their g-pawn. It doesn't change the evaluation that much. We're still at +0.9, despite what the game review counts as an inaccuracy. And they're supposed to take back with the h-pawn, which makes sense. I don't have a rook over here. And if you take with this, then that opens this whole file. But that's what they did, and that was counted as a mistake. I'm supposed to play queen to g4 now. Queen to g4 right here. Because their e-pawn's unprotected. Okay. Kind of a sidestep in order to get around my own pawn there, because I can't curve with my queen. So I have to go this way and then aim at that. It says if I did play here, they would play knight to f8, which would defend their e-pawn, and then I would put my knight where my queen is now. I'm not sure that I would. That kind of eludes me. But I saw what they were doing with this pawn idea here, so I dropped my queen back to get it out of that pin. It says that's good, but it drops the evaluation back a little bit. My opponent put their bishop out here. Again, I'm pretty sure focusing on this whole c-pawn idea, hoping to advance with the rook behind it and then this rook coming across here. Right now they have 2 attackers on this pawn and I only have 1 defender on it. But I decided not to worry about that. I threw my knight in there, and that turns out to be my best move. Perhaps obviously, because this pawn's undefended, the king can't move, because my knight and bishop are cutting off those squares. And once my knight goes there, my queen's going to be able to come in here. Now before I didn't know why I should put my queen on h6, but now I do. Because now that they've brought this bishop out, nothing's preventing me from getting in here. Also, once my knight takes there, it could possibly come back after my queen's over here, and then it would be guarding the h7 square. Something like that. It was kind of a vague plan. Well, my opponent took that pawn, which was counted as inaccurate, but you saw the evaluation jump from +3. Again, they're supposed to put this knight back here to start defending against all the things going on over there. But they took that pawn, which was their plan all along, and now they're going to have a discovered attack on my queen unless I move my queen to f3. I didn't want to move it to just f3, although I see now that I would have been aiming here. I thought if I moved it to f3, they could just put this rook here, but now in hindsight, I see that I could have just taken it. But I went all the way over, because my knight's already guarding that square, so now don't they have to play the h-pawn? I think I would have played it to h5, which is what my opponent did, but they weren't supposed to. They were supposed to play it to h6, if at all. But their best move again is knight to f8, which would guard that square. But then wouldn't I take it? It says I would. If they played knight to f8, I would take it with my bishop, and then they would play queen to b7. Oh, because their knight wouldn't be in the way anymore, and their queen would be guarding that square. Oh, wow. I don't think I would have seen that, and of course my opponent didn't see it. They played h5, which, as I said, is probably what I would have done in the circumstances. The problem there is that this pawn, their e-pawn, is still undefended, and now I have 2 pieces on it, my knight and my queen. Stockfish says I have a mate in 7 if I'll take it with my queen. Well, I've already told you I had something like 17 checks in this game, and you haven't seen one yet, so you know I didn't find mate in 7. Simple logic will tell you that. I did consider taking it with my knight because that would have been an attack on this rook, but the whole reason I had moved my queen all the way over here wasn't just to attack their h-pawn, it was to attack this e-pawn. So that's what I did. This is my first check. We're on move 29. This is a 40-something move game, and almost all the rest of my moves are checks, and we're about to find out if they were the best ones or not, which is the whole reason that I sat down here to make this video today. There were only 2 legal moves. My opponent made the best one, which was king to g7. Now, Stockfish says I'll have mate in 6 if I'll check right here, right now, on f7, because the king would have to go back. Well, I reasoned that if the king went in there, then my knight would be hanging, and I would have to do something. Stockfish says I would play knight to e6 at that point. That's what it says there in the line. Oh, but the square where my queen is now, it would go there, which attacks the rook. Oh, wow. Not only does it attack the rook, but from e6, the knight would be guarding both of those squares, which my queen could then move to, and it would be mate. Except they would stop it with, they would slow it down with a couple of other moves, like putting their rook over on g8 or something. Okay, well, I didn't see that, and I think the reason I didn't see it is because my queen's there right now. And like many players in the medium to low ratings, I sometimes have a hard time seeing that my knight can go there, because it can't. But if I first moved my queen to f7, and the king went after my knight, which is what I was worried about, it wouldn't matter because my queen's not on e6 anymore, so my knight can go there. Wow. Okay, well, that's something I need to practice, is visualizing that once my piece moves, that square's empty. because right now that square's not empty, but it would be empty if I played the best move here. Okay, well that's why I didn't play that, is because it looked like I would then have to run away with my knight, and I didn't see that I would be very close to threatening mate over here. But I played the next best move because I saw a hanging piece that comes with check, and that there's nothing they can do about it. So I took that. Stockfish says I still have mate in 8, and their best move is king to h6, which they did, but again, my knight's hanging, so I should play knight to e6, as we know from the previous turn, because from there the knight will guard these 2 squares and my queen can come over. Almost as good is queen to h7. The king would take my knight, but I would still have a mating sequence because I would check down here, the king would be driven out, and then I guess I could either come back over here to check or bring my queen up this way. It would get complicated, and the line goes off the screen there, so I'm not sure exactly what it says. If I moved my knight to e6, their best move is just to hang their queen. Wow. Okay. Well, now we know that several of the checks that I made were not the best ones, but here I checked down here. The idea is the king can't come out this way, because my knight's guarding that square as well as this one. They can't block a knight check, and they can't capture the knight, so the king would have to come out to one of the 2 squares on the 7th rank. Now my idea was, once the king got there, then I can move this knight wherever I want, and they'll be in check from the queen. The problem is I can't move the knight someplace that would also guard that square. So where would I move the knight? That's the question. Well, they had to move their king to one of those 2 squares, as I said, and now my best move is to put the knight back where it was, because Stockfish has already seen that mating sequence over there that we just talked about a couple of times. But instead I went there, and I thought that was pretty good because I didn't see Stockfish's mating sequence, but I did see that now their rook's cut off from these squares, so their rook's not going to be able to come and help, and they can't just take it because they're in check. So they have to move, and they have numerous choices this time. They chose to go back to where they were. Now that the rook doesn't guard this back rank, I can check with the bishop. And this time that does turn out to be my best move, so I did that. Now I am aware of this tension here between the rook and the queen, but I also know that they can't take my queen while they're in check from another piece, which they are right now. So their king has to run away, because my queen was cutting off that whole thing and my bishop was cutting off this diagonal, so the king had to run out between those 2 pawns. Okay, I did not find the best check here either. Stockfish says just slide over one with the queen and quit worrying about this. You can check there, and that forces the king further out into the open. Or it's been liking knight to e6 this whole time. That's the second best move, but I played the third best check, which is this one. Now I don't know how many checks we are into this sequence, but I know that the king can't come back in there now because the bishop and the knight now are both guarding that square. Let's see, my queen is cutting off this, my pawn's cutting off this, the knight and the bishop are hitting there, my queen's cutting off that, so there are only 2 choices, f4 or h4. Now h4 is a mate in 1. I don't know that I would have found it. If they played king to h4, all I had to do was move a pawn up and it would have been mate. Maybe my opponent saw that, but they did the better move, which leaves me with an 8-move mating sequence. Well, one of my ideas for driving the king out this way was that once it got past that g5 square, I could put the bishop there on h6 and drive it even further into my territory. This pawn is protected by the knight, and again, my queen's cutting off all of this. Once my bishop's there, it's going to hit these squares, and my g-pawn is covering f3. So the king's going to be forced over there. So I checked there. There is the option of blocking with the g-pawn, obviously, but then I would just take it, so the king went that way. Now I have mate in 6, and I still don't have to worry about the rook hitting my queen because I can check with the rook. Those 2 rooks down there haven't done anything yet, except nominally protecting each other, finally get in the game. The king can't go back behind its own rook because my queen is still back there, so it has to go in front of its rook. I'm surprised I saw this one, because it's one of those things where the queen is moving on a diagonal away, seemingly away from the action in order to point right at the action, but I did see it because I was looking at a bunch of checks. And now the king can't come back this way because of the rook, cutting off all of these. Here there are 2 choices. And remember, my bishop is cutting off this entire diagonal, so the king only has 2 choices here. I assumed it would choose c4, and that is the best choice, and that is what my opponent chose. Now I can get my other rook into the game. Oh, Stockfish says that's the best move. And the second best move is to bring my other rook over. Knight to d6 is my next best move. See, I thought about that, but I thought at this point, after running their king all the way across the board, they'd probably be willing to sacrifice a rook for it. And that would give me one less piece to check with. So I checked with the queen, which takes us to a mate in 10 sequence. It wasn't even one of my top 3 moves. Well, again, they're only left with 2 choices here. My opponent made the best of those choices, circling all the way around their rook, and look like they're headed back over this way. Here, queen to f3 is my best check, because the knight cuts off those squares. My queen would cut off these. Queen to f3 check is my best move. My second best move is e6. My third best move is queen to h3, to go all the way over here. Well, this was counted as inaccurate by the engine when I took this pawn with check. Now it's only plus 12. Stockfish can't even find a mating sequence anymore. My opponent's best move is to block with their queen, but instead they blocked with the rook, which takes us to mate in 6 again, because I can go over here to f3 and check. But instead, I decided I've got a rook that hasn't been used this entire game, so I brought that rook over to check. And this rook can't block because it's pinned. But now they can block with the bishop. Stockfish says my best move is to take the bishop with my rook, and they wouldn't take back, they would just step aside. But now I found queen to f3 check, which I did, and now their rook can't come across to block because the bishop's in the way. And also my rook's guarding that square. There's only a few choices. King to c5 is one choice. King to e6 is the other choice. Which one did they choose? They chose the best one, which leaves us at about plus 12. And here I should point out that despite all this checking and chasing the king around the board in different pins and skewers and whatnot, I've only managed to pick off one of my opponent's pieces and one of their pawns. I'm only up 4 points of material. Stockfish says my best move is knight to d6, which would be protected by the pawn, and it would attack that rook. Oh, it's a fork of the rooks. Oh, well, I probably considered that, but I can't tell you why I didn't do it. My second best move is b3, which attacks the rook, but leaves this pawn hanging. I assume they would move the rook at that point. It says if I played b3, they would play rook to c3, which attacks my queen, protected by the bishop. And my third best move is bishop to e3, and that's the one I chose. I chose bishop to e3, and I assume it's because I'm not worried about them taking my bishop here because their king's lined up with it. And if they don't take, I'm going to take them. Their best move is to make a run for it with the king over to the b file and try to get away back there behind that rook and the queen and the pawn. But instead they took my bishop, which is kind of what I was hoping they would do. And I checked again. So that bishop move was the only move in this long sequence that wasn't a check, but it set up this check. So now the king has to run over to the b file or block with the rook again, which they're not going to do, so they ran. And this time I found knight to d6 because it not only forks the two rooks, but it is also a check. Now my opponent has to go to the a file. There are only 2 choices. They chose that one. Well, now I can check with the pawn, which I did. It's protected by the queen. It also attacks this rook. It does allow them to take this pawn, though. Their best move was to move back, but they took that pawn. The problem with that, of course, is that I'm going to check with this rook and win their queen. That's not my best move. Believe it or not, my best move is to take that rook with the pawn, and that's check. But instead I did that. My opponent moved out of check, and I took their queen. So the second move in this long string that's not a check. And there they resigned. They didn't resign when I chased their king all the way around over here through how many, 18, 19 moves? But they resigned when I took their queen for free. There's no compensation for that, and one of their rooks is still hanging. Multiple ways. And because that pawn's in between their rooks aren't going to be able to protect each other. My opponent's best move at this point would be rook to c2. I don't know why, but that's what Stockfish has come up with. Or rook to a4, which that also looks bad because I would just take it. But anyway, okay, well, we did find out, according to the engine, that a lot of those checks were not my best move. What I had to see way back here is that when the king went up, instead of taking a knight, should have checked closer and not worried about the king getting close to my knight, because my knight could always come back here. That wouldn't be a check, but it would be setting up a mate. But I was aware that a lot of times when you get on one of these wild checking sequences, as soon as you stop checking and that gives the opponent an opportunity to do something, sometimes they do something devastating. Sometimes they've just been waiting to do something. And as soon as you stop checking, they do something. That was one reason that I decided to just check. And it's also one reason that I decided to take pieces when I could. But as it turned out, that was one of the only pieces I got for a long time until they traded their bishop for mine. And then, of course, I got their queen. So if I counted right, there were 17 checks in this game, only broken up by that one bishop move. And then when I took their queen at the end. Okay, so I did okay, but I could have done better. Probably need to do some more checkmating puzzles. But here, I don't know that I would have found it if in this situation. If this is the situation that a puzzle gives me, would I take the knight or would I go there? I know that no matter what's going on, it's harder for the opponent to win if they have fewer pieces. And six moves is still a long mating sequence for me. But again, I think I understand the concept, but let's just follow this out just before I end this video, which has already gone on too long. If I had checked here, they only have 2 legal moves. And of course, if they go back into the corner, I have mate there on h7, guarded by the knight. So they would probably come up here, threatening my knight. And then I would have to bring it here, knowing that my knight's protecting both of those squares, setting up a checkmate. So the longest that my opponent can postpone that mate is by starting to give away pieces. Queen to f1 check, which it's best for me to take with my rook. But again, I'm not checking them, so they have an opportunity to do something. And it says their best move that postpones mate the longest is h4, because now when I check here, they can get out of it. So they would get out of it. Then I would check on h7, my best move by far, and they can get out of it. And that's mate. Because my pawns are cutting off all 3 of these squares, my knight's cutting off that square. And from here, my queen would cut off all of those. Now, in a puzzle, especially if I was doing a series of mate in 1 puzzles, I probably would find this. Probably. But in a game, I don't know. I mean, I might have done it just to pick up an extra pawn, but you saw that that's the mindset that had me taking this knight over here earlier, which lengthened the mating sequence to not even a mating sequence there by the end. It lengthened it out to 17, 18, 19 moves. Well, I hope you learned something from this. One of the lessons that I learned a long time ago is when you can check, you should. Just as a general principle. Obviously, there are times when it's not the best idea. But there are definitely times when if you can safely check, it forces your opponent to do something. They can't do anything to you while you're checking them. And so if it's a check from a safe position where the square is guarded so their king can't take and so on, or if you have enough attackers on those squares, most likely your opponent's going to run into places that they can't get out of, or they're going to end up losing pieces in the process. Or like in this case, they're going to get their king chased all the way across the board, and then there's going to end up being a skewer or a pin or something that you can take advantage of. Well, this has gone on too long, but I did want to share this game with you that had 17 whatever checks in it. Thank you for spending your time here. Also, just a day or so ago, we hit 900 subscribers. I'm really, really appreciative of all of you. I never thought this many people would watch my videos, just recording me trying to get better at chess, analyzing my games, solving puzzles. So thank you for spending your time here. I'll see you next time.